Before we start, let me ask you something. If you care about history that doesn't sound like a lecture, if you like stories that feel like someone is sitting across from you and talking, then take a moment and subscribe to the channel. It helps this kind of content survive. And now, let's begin. There is a version of the end of World War II that people like to tell. It's clean, it's simple. Heroes on one side, villains on the other, and a clear moral line drawn in ink. But real history almost never behaves that way. Sometimes the most powerful moments are quiet, small, almost easy to miss. This is one of those moments. In the spring of 1945, as the American army moved deeper into Germany, temporary holding camps were set up across the countryside. These were not extermination camps, not labor camps in the infamous sense, but improvised facilities meant to contain civilians while the old order collapsed and the new one had not yet formed. Many of the detainees were women, German women. Some had fled bombed cities. Some had lost husbands, brothers, entire families. Some had simply been in the wrong place when authority dissolved overnight. They arrived exhausted, suspicious, and emotionally numb. And then something unexpected happened. During the first week, American officers made a decision that, on paper, meant almost nothing. They allowed the women to shower freely, not military-style rinses, not cold water in a rush. Actual showers, with warm water, with soap, with shampoo. They were also given clean clothes afterward, no propaganda, no announcement, no speech about American values, just permission. And that permission shocked them far more than captivity ever had. Think about that for a second. If you had been living for months under constant fear, scarcity, and control, would cleanliness even register as kindness? Or would it feel suspicious, like the calm before something worse? I want you to really sit with that question, and if you feel like it, write your answer in the comments. Your reaction matters more than you think. Eyewitness accounts describe the same pattern again and again. When the women were told they could shower, many of them didn't move. Some asked the same question twice, in slightly different words, as if the first answer couldn't possibly be correct. Are we really allowed? Is this just today? Is there a rule? The concept of being trusted with something as simple as hot water had become foreign. Several women reportedly asked whether they were allowed to use shampoo. That detail shows up in multiple accounts, which tells you something important. This wasn't about hygiene alone. Shampoo meant care, it meant time, it meant being seen as a person, not a problem. And that idea felt unreal. After the showers, the women were issued clean civilian clothing. Plain, modest, nothing symbolic about it. Yet many of them examined the fabric closely, rubbing it between their fingers, checking seams, asking again whether the clothes were truly theirs to keep. Some stood awkwardly, unsure where to put their old garments, as if waiting for someone to correct them. No one did. Here's something that surprises people when they hear this story. There was no visible celebration, no crying, no open gratitude. Instead, there was quiet, a deep, heavy silence. Psychologists would later describe this reaction as cognitive shock, when kindness contradicts everything your nervous system has learned to expect, when relief doesn't feel safe yet. If you've ever experienced a moment where something good happened, but your body didn't know how to accept it, you'll understand exactly what that silence meant. Did any part of this surprise you so far? Which detail stays with you the most? The shampoo, the clothes, the hesitation? Tell me. I read the comments. By the end of the week, something subtle had changed. Not dramatically, not visibly to an outsider. But witnesses noted that the women walked differently. They spoke a little more. They held themselves upright, not with confidence, but with presence. Cleanliness had restored something the war had taken without asking. A sense of self. And that, ironically, was the most unsettling part for everyone involved. Because dignity doesn't come with instructions. In the next part, we'll talk about what happened when one of the women finally asked the question no one expected. Why are you doing this? And why the Americans didn't know how to answer. By the end of that first week, routines had settled in. Meals were served at regular hours. Roll calls became predictable. The showers were no longer treated like an exception, but like a fact of life. And that's when the most dangerous moment arrived. Not anger, not resistance, a question. It came from a woman who had not spoken much before. Not outspoken, not withdrawn either. The kind of person who watches first, then decides whether something is real. She approached one of the American officers through the interpreter. Her tone was calm, polite. She asked simply, "Why are you doing this?" Not "What are you doing?" Not "How long will this last?" Why? That question landed badly, because no one had prepared an answer. There was no official reasoning, no document that explained the showers or the clothes or the small mercies of the first week. It had all happened informally, driven by individual decisions that felt obvious at the time. But now, confronted with the need to explain it, those decisions suddenly felt fragile. The officer hesitated. The interpreter hesitated too. And for a moment, everyone stood there, unsure. Eventually, the answer came out awkwardly. Because you're civilians. Because there's no reason not to. Because the war is ending. None of these answers satisfied her. She listened carefully, nodded once, and then said something else. In the past years, she said, when people were kind, it usually meant they wanted something later. That sentence tells you everything you need to know about what the war had done to people. If you were standing there, what would you have said? Would you even know how to respond? Take a moment and think about that. And if you want, write it down in the comments. From that point on, the atmosphere shifted again. Not backward, not forward, sideways. The women began observing the Americans more closely. Not with fear, but with curiosity. They watched how officers spoke to each other, how rules were enforced, how mistakes were handled. They were looking for patterns, punishment patterns, reward patterns. They expected kindness to come with conditions, but it didn't. One detail that appears repeatedly in later testimonies is how strange it felt to be corrected without being humiliated. If someone lined up incorrectly, they were simply told to adjust. If someone misunderstood an instruction, it was explained again. No shouting, no threats. That alone caused confusion. Several women later said that this form of authority felt unreal, almost theatrical, as if the Americans were playing a role that would eventually end. They kept waiting for the switch, and yet daily life continued. Clean clothes were washed and reused, hair stayed clean, personal habits slowly returned. Some women began braiding each other's hair again. Others asked for needles and thread to repair small tears in their clothing. These are small acts, but small acts are how people rebuild themselves. Which part of this stands out to you most so far? The question? The lack of punishment? The slow return of routine? I'm curious what you're noticing. There was another reaction the Americans didn't expect. Shame. Not guilt for the war. Not political shame. Something quieter. Being treated well made some of the women confront how poorly others had been treated under German authority, how normalized cruelty had become, how rare unconditioned decency really was. One woman reportedly said later that the showers made her feel more exposed than nakedness ever had, because kindness removes excuses. By the second week, the women were no longer shocked by the showers. They were shocked by the fact that nothing bad followed. No interrogation, no retaliation, no hidden price. And that realization was unsettling in its own way, because it meant the world they had been taught to expect was no longer the only one possible. There's a strange thing about laughter. People think it's the opposite of fear. It isn't. Laughter usually comes after fear has loosened its grip, just a little, not enough to feel safe, but enough to let something human leak through. That's what happened next. It started quietly. One afternoon, near the washing area, two women were arguing about something trivial, a missing sock, a misplaced towel. No one remembers exactly what it was. The interpreter later said it sounded almost ridiculous. And then one of them laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't confident. It came out wrong, like a cough that surprised its owner. For a split second, everything froze. Laughter didn't belong here. Not yet. Not in a place that still called itself a camp. But then the other woman laughed too. And just like that, something cracked open. Witnesses describe it as deeply uncomfortable. Not for the women. For the Americans. Several soldiers later admitted they didn't know how to react. Laughter felt inappropriate, almost disrespectful to the dead, to the war, to the gravity of everything that had happened. One soldier reportedly said, "It felt like laughing at a funeral." But funerals end, and camps apparently change. The women didn't laugh often, and when they did, it was quick, almost guilty, as if joy itself might be confiscated. But it happened again, and again. Sometimes during meals, sometimes when someone mispronounced an English word, sometimes when nothing made sense at all. If you've ever been in a situation where laughing felt dangerous, you understand this part. That moment where humor sneaks up on you before you can stop it. How would you have reacted if you were there? Would you have joined in? Or felt uncomfortable, like the soldiers did? Tell me honestly. Around this time, the Americans noticed something else. The women had started asking questions that had nothing to do with survival. Not what will happen to us. Not how long are we staying. But things like, is that your real accent? Do people really live in houses like that in America? Do women there work? These were not strategic questions. They were curious questions, and curiosity is a sign of the future. One officer later wrote that this was the moment he realized the war was truly ending, not because of surrender documents or maps, but because people had begun imagining life beyond the present moment. That realization came with discomfort, because imagination creates responsibility. The women, too, were changing in ways they didn't fully understand. Several later said that the showers and clean clothes had not just restored comfort, but memory. They began remembering who they were before the war, what they liked, what they disliked, what they used to talk about. One woman said she suddenly remembered a dress she had owned years earlier and felt embarrassed that she could still miss something so small. Another admitted she felt guilty for enjoying the warmth of water when so many others had suffered far worse. If you've ever felt guilty for feeling okay after hardship, you know this conflict well. Would you allow yourself that comfort, or would you punish yourself for it? Think about it. Not all reactions were positive. Some women withdrew further. Kindness made them cautious, almost suspicious. A few refused to shower regularly, even though they were allowed. Others kept wearing the same clothes longer than necessary. Psychologists later suggested this was a form of control. When everything else had been taken, choosing discomfort felt like reclaiming agency. That's a hard thing to understand unless you've lived it. The Americans struggled too. Several officers debated whether they had gone too far, whether they were blurring lines, whether they were setting expectations they couldn't keep. Kindness, it turned out, carried its own risks. What happens when you humanize people in a system built to contain them? No one had a clear answer. By the third week, the camp no longer felt frozen in time. It still wasn't free. It still wasn't fair. But it was moving. And movement changes everything. When the news came, it didn't arrive with ceremony. No speeches, no flags, no dramatic pauses. It came the way most life-changing information does, casually, almost carelessly, folded into an ordinary moment. An officer mentioned it while explaining the week's schedule. "There's a possibility," he said, "that some of you may be released soon." That was it. No date, no guarantees, just a possibility. And the reaction was not what anyone expected. There was no cheering. No visible relief. Instead, the room filled with something heavier. Fear. Not the sharp fear of danger, but the slow, nauseating kind. The kind that comes when you realize you may have to decide things again. Because captivity removes choice. And choice, after a long time, becomes terrifying. Several women asked the same question, worded differently. Where would we go? Who decides? What if there is nothing left? One woman asked whether she would be allowed to stay longer if she wanted to. That question unsettled everyone. If you think about it honestly, it makes sense. The camp, for all its limitations, had become predictable. Food arrived, water was warm, no one shouted, no one disappeared in the night. Outside, Germany was rubble, cities were gone, families were missing, social structures had collapsed, freedom meant uncertainty, and uncertainty is not always a gift. Would you feel ready to leave, or would you hesitate too? Tell me what you think. There's no wrong answer here. The American officers were caught off guard. They had assumed release would be welcomed automatically, like the lifting of a weight. Instead, they found themselves explaining freedom to people who had forgotten what it felt like to make plans. One officer later said this was the moment he realized how deep psychological damage goes. You can end a war on paper, but you cannot instantly restore a future. Some women reacted with urgency. They began packing immediately, even though no release date existed, folding clothes, organizing belongings, preparing for movement. Others did the opposite. They delayed. They lingered in the showers. They washed their clothes more slowly, as if time itself had become fragile. One witness described it as people practicing leaving without actually leaving. And then there were the conversations, quiet ones, late ones, women discussing where they might go, whether it was better to return to a destroyed hometown or start somewhere unfamiliar, whether anyone would recognize them anymore. Clean hair and clean clothes had restored their bodies. Now they had to confront their lives. That's a much harder task. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Kindness creates attachment. The American soldiers, especially the younger ones, struggled with this. They had not intended to become symbols of safety. They had simply done what felt decent. But now they represented stability in a world that had lost it. Some women avoided eye contact in those days, afraid of feeling gratitude too strongly. Others sought out conversations, asking about America, about cities, about what life looked like somewhere else. Hope is risky when you don't know where to put it. One interpreter later recalled a woman saying, "If this is what the enemy looks like, then I don't know who we were fighting anymore." That sentence stayed with him. It stays with people who hear this story even now. What would it do to your understanding of the world if your enemy treated you with care? Take a moment with that thought. By the end of the fourth week, lists were being prepared, names discussed, logistics considered. Release was becoming real, and with it came a final, quiet transformation. The women stopped asking whether they were allowed to shower. They simply did. That small shift mattered more than any announcement. The morning the first group was scheduled to leave, the camp woke up earlier than usual. No one had announced a specific time, no siren, no formal call. And yet, people were already moving, quietly, purposefully. The women chosen for release had been told the night before, not in a public list, not shouted across the yard. Each name was spoken calmly, one by one, through the interpreter. Some women reacted with relief, some with visible tension. A few said nothing at all. But what happened next was unexpected. They all went to shower. Not because they were told to, not because it was practical, because it mattered. Eyewitnesses recall that the showers that morning took longer than usual, not out of indulgence, but care. Hair was washed twice, clothes were smoothed carefully, buttons checked. One woman reportedly borrowed a comb from another, even though she had already combed her hair earlier. This wasn't vanity. It was preparation for being seen again. Let's pause here for a second. If you were about to step back into a world that had broken apart, what would you want control over? Your papers, your destination, or simply how you looked when you reappeared? Think about that. And if you feel comfortable, share it in the comments. Just before the gate opened, something happened that no officer had ordered. The women who were leaving gathered together. So did the women who were staying. Not in rows, not formally. They stood close, hands touched sleeves, shoulders leaned in. A few quiet words were exchanged. Names were repeated softly, as if memorizing them again. There was no dramatic farewell, no crying fits, just presence. Then one of the women did something small but unforgettable. She turned toward one of the American officers and held out her hand. Not a salute, not gratitude spoken aloud. A handshake. It caught him off guard. He hesitated just a second and then shook her hand. Others followed, not all of them, but enough. And suddenly the camp was no longer just a place of holding. It was a place where people had met each other. That distinction matters. Several soldiers later said this moment unsettled them more than combat ever had. Because shaking hands dissolves distance. It turns them into someone with a grip, a pulse, a temperature. And once that happens, you don't get to retreat into abstractions again. As the women walked toward the gate, no one rushed them. They moved slowly, carrying small bundles. Some turned back once, some didn't. One witness remembered a woman stopping just before the gate, adjusting her collar and taking a deep breath, as if stepping onto a stage. Then the gate opened, and they were gone. What stayed behind was silence, a different kind than before, not shock, not fear, absence. The women who remained returned to their routines, but something had shifted. The camp now had proof that release was real. That mattered, but it also raised new questions. Who would be next? When? And who would be left behind? The Americans felt it too. Several officers later admitted they avoided the gate that afternoon. Watching people leave felt heavier than guarding them, because once you help someone walk out, you can't pretend neutrality anymore. You've taken a side. After the gate closed, nothing dramatic happened. No alarms, no sudden orders, just people returning to where they had been standing before. Only now, fewer of them. Absence has weight, and everyone felt it. The women who remained didn't talk much that day. They went through routines carefully, almost mechanically. Meals were eaten more slowly. Conversations paused more often. The empty spaces where people had stood that morning felt louder than any noise. Some women avoided the showers that evening. Others went immediately. It split along invisible lines. Those who showered seemed to be rehearsing for their own departure. Those who didn't were holding on to the present, unsure whether it was safer than imagining what came next. Both reactions made sense. One interpreter later wrote something that stuck with me. He said the camp had crossed a psychological threshold. Before, the women had been waiting. Now they were comparing. Who left? Who stayed? Why? And comparison changes everything. There was no resentment toward the women who had been released. That surprised the Americans. Instead, there was something closer to cautious hope. If it happened once, it could happen again. But hope, when rationed, becomes fragile. Around this time, the Americans made another small decision. They loosened internal restrictions. Nothing official, nothing written down. Women were allowed to gather more freely, to sit together in groups that weren't assigned, to walk the yard without constant direction. It wasn't freedom, but it was trust. And trust after a war is a radical thing. One officer later admitted that this decision worried him. Kindness had already complicated things. Now trust was doing the same. Because the more human everyone became, the harder it was to think in terms of management or containment. Systems prefer distance. People don't. The women noticed immediately. They always did. Some took advantage quietly, longer conversations, shared memories, whispered plans. Others tested boundaries cautiously, asking questions before acting, as if afraid to misinterpret the shift. A few refused to change their behavior at all. That, too, was a choice. If you were there, which would you have been? The one who steps forward, the one who watches, or the one who waits for proof? Take a moment with that. There's a detail from this period that rarely gets mentioned. Music. Someone began humming one evening. No instruments, no songs anyone recognized fully. Just fragments. Another woman joined in, then another. Not loudly, almost experimentally, as if checking whether sound itself was allowed. No one stopped them. An American guard later said that was the moment he stopped thinking of the camp as temporary, not because of policy, but because culture had returned, and culture only returns when people believe they might still have a future. By the end of the 6th week, the camp no longer felt suspended. It felt transitional. That may sound like a small difference. It isn't. Transitional spaces imply direction, and direction implies choice. The second release came faster than anyone expected. That alone unsettled people. The first release had felt like an exception. The second made it a pattern. Lists were prepared again, names spoken quietly, without ceremony. The same careful explanations, the same vague timelines, and again reactions varied: relief, tension, silence. But this time something different happened. One woman said no. At first, the Americans thought there had been a misunderstanding. The interpreter repeated the message, clarified it, slowed down. "You're cleared to leave," he said. "You don't have to stay." The woman listened calmly. Then she shook her head. "I understand," she said, "but I'm not leaving." The room went still. She wasn't dramatic about it. She wasn't defiant. She spoke like someone declining an invitation, not refusing freedom. When asked why, she gave an answer no one had prepared for. "I know how to live here," she said. "I don't know how to live out there anymore." That sentence landed hard because it wasn't fear of punishment keeping her in the camp. It was fear of choice. Think about that for a moment. If your entire world had collapsed, if every familiar structure had vanished, and one place, even a limited one, offered routine, safety, and human treatment, would you leave, or would you hesitate too? Be honest with yourself, and if you feel it, write your answer below. The officers discussed what to do. There was no rule book for refusal of release. Eventually, they told her she could stay, for now, but that the option to leave would remain open. She nodded, relieved. That relief confused the Americans more than anything else had. The other women reacted quietly. Some understood immediately, others didn't. A few whispered that she was foolish, that freedom should never be refused, but none mocked her, because everyone recognized the feeling beneath her decision. The world outside demanded something they were no longer sure they could give. Over the next days, the woman who stayed became a kind of anchor. Not a leader, not a spokesperson, just a presence. She helped newcomers understand routines. She explained unspoken rules. She reminded others that staying, for now, was allowed, that mattered, because it reframed the camp, not as a trap, but as a threshold. The Americans noticed another shift. Requests changed. Instead of asking if they were allowed to do something, women began asking how things worked. How do people find work now? How do you rebuild papers? What happens if you have nowhere to go? These were questions about continuity, about surviving beyond survival. One officer later said this was the moment he realized the camp was no longer just holding people. It was preparing them. Not intentionally, not officially, but inevitably. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Kindness had consequences. It raised expectations. It created attachment. It made neutrality impossible. Once you treat people as people, you inherit responsibility for what happens next. That realization weighed heavily. By the end of the second release, the camp felt divided, not between prisoners and guards, but between those ready to leave and those still gathering themselves. Both groups watched each other closely, and everyone understood one thing. The next step would hurt, no matter what it was. Up to this point, the story sounds like it belongs to the women, and it does. But something else was happening quietly, almost invisibly, on the other side. The Americans were changing too. Most of the soldiers assigned to the camp were young, younger than people imagine when they picture authority. Many had never been responsible for anyone's well-being before. They had trained for combat, not for stewardship. Guarding people is simple, caring for them is not. And somewhere between those two roles, lines began to blur. At first, the soldiers told themselves this was temporary, a few weeks, a transition, a task to complete and move on from. But routine has a way of settling into the body. Names were learned, faces became familiar. Small habits stood out. Who always stood near the windows? Who braided hair in the evenings? Who avoided conversation but listened carefully? You can't notice those things without becoming involved. Several officers later admitted they began adjusting their behavior unconsciously. They chose words more carefully. They explained rules instead of enforcing them bluntly. They hesitated before raising their voices, not because they were ordered to, because it felt wrong not to. One soldier wrote in a letter home that the camp had taught him something he hadn't expected. He said, "I thought mercy was weakness. Turns out it's work." That sentence never left him. It didn't leave the others either. But kindness also produced tension among the Americans. Not everyone agreed with how things were being handled. Some worried they were being naive. Some feared setting precedents. Others questioned whether emotional involvement compromised discipline. These debates weren't loud. They happened late at night. Quiet conversations, cigarettes shared, voices lowered. There was no clear answer. There rarely is. One officer later said the hardest part was realizing that moral clarity doesn't come with comfort. You can do the right thing and still feel unsure. You can act decently and still question yourself. That ambiguity haunted some of them long after the war ended. Here's something rarely acknowledged. Several soldiers admitted they felt guilt, not for what they did, but for how late they learned it was possible. Treating people humanely had not weakened control. It had strengthened stability. That realization forced them to reevaluate everything they had accepted before. Authority, obedience, enemy narratives. Those questions don't disappear easily. Let me ask you something here. If you discovered, in the middle of your life, that you could have chosen kindness earlier, but didn't know how would you live with that knowledge? Sit with that. It's not an easy question. By the time the camp began winding down, some soldiers requested transfers. Not because they couldn't handle the work, because they couldn't leave it behind emotionally. Others did the opposite. They stayed until the end, wanting to see the process through, needing closure they couldn't articulate. Both reactions came from the same place: connection. When the final releases came, they were quieter than the first. Less confusion, less shock. By then, everyone understood what leaving meant, and what it didn't. The final day didn't feel like an ending. That surprised everyone. No one woke up thinking, "This is it." No one marked the hours. The camp simply thinned out. By then, most of the women had already left, in small groups, on different days, with different destinations and different levels of certainty. What remained was a skeleton of routine: fewer footsteps, shorter lines, more empty space, and a strange sense of politeness, as if everyone, Americans and Germans alike, was trying not to disturb something fragile. The last women to leave were not the weakest. They were not the strongest either. They were the ones who needed the most time, time to remember names, time to let habits dissolve, time to believe that the world outside would not immediately punish them for existing. When their names were finally called, they didn't rush. They had learned that rushing belonged to the old world. One of the officers later said that the final releases felt less like liberation and more like farewell, not to a place, to a version of themselves. The women who had arrived weeks earlier, exhausted, suspicious, guarded, were gone. The women who left were still wounded, still uncertain, but they carried something new, expectation. Just before the last group departed, something quiet happened. No one organized it. No one announced it. They stood together, Americans on one side, women on the other, not separated by orders but by habit. And for a moment, no one moved. Then someone spoke, not loudly, not formally. "Take care of yourself." It wasn't translated. It didn't need to be. That's the thing about human language. When it's real, it crosses borders easily. There were no speeches about democracy, no lectures about the future. No one tried to explain what this moment meant, because explaining it would have diminished it. The women left, the gate closed, and the camp was suddenly just structures again. Wood, wire, empty rooms. Afterward, the Americans dismantled it quickly. That was intentional. Leaving it standing would have invited memory to linger too long, and some memories need distance before they can be understood. Years later, when historians asked soldiers what they remembered most, many did not mention strategy, or maps, or victories. They mentioned showers, clean clothes, a question about shampoo, a refusal to leave, a handshake, small things. Because small things are where humanity hides when everything else collapses. Let me ask you one last question. If history is made not only by battles, but by moments like this, moments no one planned, no one recorded properly, how many stories do you think we've already lost? Sit with that. This story doesn't end with a lesson. It ends with a reminder that dignity, once given, cannot be unseen, and that sometimes the most powerful act in a broken world is simply allowing someone to feel human again. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing, not for algorithms, not for numbers, but because stories like this disappear when no one listens. Tell me in the comments, which moment will you remember? And thank you for staying until the end.